The theory that consciousness is epiphenomenal is pretty much assumed by much establishment science today, in spite of the fact that no one has ever proposed the faintest inkling of a solution to David Chalmers' hard problem that points out that even if we mapped every atom in the brain, we would not actually arrive at consciousness. The view that we will inevitably stumble upon a feature of the brain that offers us an explanation for consciousness remains strangely persistent. In spite of apparently banishing metaphysical speculation, there are ironically metaphysical reasons for this. Science has siloed much of its work in a materialist position, from which other kinds of solutions to the problem of consciousness sound far too much like spirituality to be taken remotely seriously. The question, though, is still one that science has to have some role in considering, and there are some fascinating insights into which we can shed light into an alternative way of viewing consciousness. The epiphenomenal view of consciousness essentially assumes that the brain emits consciousness. That is to say, the material of the brain contains a set of processes that somehow conspire to produce consciousness upwards causally, like air coming out from an air-conditioned vent. This seems like the default position, especially to those who are materialist or scientifically minded, but it has some significant problems. The first is what consciousness itself is actually doing if the brain itself exists on a level of unconscious processes. But more importantly, it has the basic problem of failing to explain where out of reality consciousness comes from. Since consciousness seems to be virtually by definition a reality different in kind, almost ontologically different from what we class as material or natural reality, how does a biological process simply come to produce it unless it is already a property of the material it has to work with? So this takes us to a second way of viewing consciousness, not as something the brain emits, but as something the brain permits. In this way of viewing consciousness, consciousness itself is a fundamental substance of reality, perhaps the fundamental substance of reality, and the brain, rather than emitting consciousness like a light bulb being turned on and generating it, permits consciousness in your particular experience in the same way a voice constrains air in order to create your particular voice. Is there any evidence for this? One of the most reliable ways to elicit at the very least a feeling of this intuition is psychedelic drugs. In fact, many of those early pioneers of psychedelics in the 20th century who experimented with psychedelics were convinced of consciousness as primary and universal after the experience of egoless consciousness that drugs such as LSD or psilocybin can elicit. One of these was Aldous Huxley, whose book The Doors of Perception was named after a quote by William Blake. If the doors of perception were cleansed, everything would appear to man as it is, infinite. For man has closed himself up, till he sees all things through narrow chinks of his cavern. Interestingly, studies of the brain on psychedelics seem to show something in common with the brains of experienced meditators. Although it remains mysterious to some extent, most significant seems to be a reduction in blood flow to an area of the brain called the default mode network, something that is interestingly the inverse of those experiencing rumination and depressive disorder, which are associated with increased connectivity in the DMN. It seems that this is a part of the brain that operates, as scientist Robin L. Carhart Harris has put it, as something like the orchestra conductor, constraining, inhibiting, and limiting other parts of the brain. By shutting this down, psychedelics seem to unconstrain cognition, allowing an increase in connections across the brain that explain the synesthetic and hallucinogenic qualities of the psychedelic experience. The DMN seems to be associated with something like the ego. It is not present in early childhood and seems to be a later evolutionary development, and its deactivation is associated with the loss of self experienced by meditation practitioners and psychedelic trips. Yet the loss of self does not reduce consciousness, rather, it seems to expand it. In a paper, The Entropic Brain, Robin L. Carhart Harris and others suggest that the brain is essentially balanced between ordered and disordered states, from high entropy, which they associate with infancy. Essentially, Harris seems to see the expansive love of the psychedelic trip as a return to the state of consciousness on your mother's breast, to low entropy, such as depression. Part of what, say, a psilocybin trip seems to be able to do is shake the snow globe of the mind by turning off the DMN enough to allow some resetting of those low entropy states the mind can become encased in. In other words, it at least temporarily lets down the prison walls of the ego. Naturally, though, this theory, while fascinating, still has a kind of problem with consciousness. It begs the obvious question, why is there this infant consciousness that seems to essentially not be created by the self, but constrained by it? In other words, what the DMN seems to be doing, or what the self or the ego or whatever is doing, is actually limiting consciousness in order for us to function properly in the world. So do the experience of meditators, mystics, poets, visionaries, or psychedelic trips allow us to witness a more universal consciousness unconstrained by the mind? It seems to me the alternative is eminently less likely, which is that consciousness is emitted by the brain from childhood, and the rest of life is spent constructing a functionality that constrains it increasingly restrictively as we get older. Why does the consciousness need to be there? What on earth is it doing? Our birth is but a sleep and a forgetting, or as Blake put it, again, if the doors of perception were cleansed, everything would appear to man as it is, infinite. For man has closed himself up till he sees all things through narrow chinks of his cavern. If your brain feels like a tangled mess, at the end consciousness is simply your awareness of yourself and the world around you. It's what lets you think, feel, and experience life. Your brain is the hardware, and consciousness is the software running on it. When you wake up in the morning and know you're awake, that's consciousness in action. But how does it work? Well, scientists are still scratching their heads over this one. Some say it's like a spotlight, focusing on different things at different times. Others think it's more like a never-ending movie playing in your mind. No one really knows for sure, but that's what makes it so fascinating.